It's my goal today to offer an overview of the evolution that has happened here in Canada, from recreating in a historical sense of the past to honoring living places that continuously evolve. Thank you. Next. Next slide, please. In the 1960s, the discipline of heritage conservation originated in part with the meticulously researched, if partial, reconstruction of the 18th century French Fortress of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia on our east coast. This seminal work spawned the Restoration Services Division of Parks Canada and eventually a network of units across the country to realize preservation writ large. In 1975, a paper for the Historic Sites and Monuments Board laid out the first criteria for the identification and evaluation of landscapes of national historic significance. In the wake of the Florence Charter, with its ideological grounding of gardens as monuments, landscapes could be considered as per the various architectural treatments, whether preservation, reconstruction, period, restoration, or rehabilitation. As a student during the 1980s, next slide, please, I learned at the feet of one of the best, Susan Buggy, who with her cohort, John Stewart, moved the discussion about landscapes in this country forward within the Parks Canada milieu. But ultimately, there was increasing discomfort within the landscape community as to an approach for entities which cannot be frozen in time. As with built heritage, it was a real struggle to speak about historic landscape preservation, given that this language and these terms were part of a decidedly more static architectural tradition. Nevertheless, a key case study during my education was the meticulous period restoration of Motherwell Homestead in Saskatchewan. It took place under the watchful eye of our colleague, Nancy Pollock-Elwan, and returned the property to a place effectively rested in time, that is to say, the early 1900s. That said, this period also saw a number of tools, techniques, and expertise arise, not to mention the emergence of the environmental movement. And yet, few were explicitly talking about heritage values. Next slide, please. Coincidentally, this was the period in which I was finishing my schooling under Susan's tutelage, out of which was born my study of Majors Hill Park here in Ottawa under the rubric of adaptive reuse, exploring values while not explicitly naming them. And it's also a quick plug for the Historic Urban Public Parks Working Group. In the 1990s, the UNESCO World Convention led to the acceptance of cultural landscapes as places of outstanding universal value. This long overdue movement away from looking at buildings on their footprints marked the advent of the era of cultural landscapes of national significance here in Canada. Next slide, please. About that time, Parks Canada had released its cultural resource management policy to better manage its heritage sites with a focus on protection and presentation. This principled approach guided the consideration and master planning of significant historic places in Canada, including the Rideau Canal, one of the first to be considered, incidentally, through the lens of the Charter, its principles and procedures. New criteria were soon developed within parks to encompass the increasingly sophisticated landscape analysis that was rapidly evolving both nationally and internationally. Next, please. Guidelines were established for both parks and gardens and for rural historic districts, including Grand Pré in Nova Scotia to the left and Gros Isle and the Irish Memorial in Quebec to the right. In this way, we were now evolving from recreating an historical sense of the past to that of protecting historic values with a more complex understanding of place as both evolved and evolving and intangible, as well as the tangible. This scholarship and these deliberations culminated in Susan Buggy's seminal work vis-a-vis Aboriginal cultural landscapes in 1999. We are now moving away from landscapes being historic, locked in the past, to recognizing that these were living and lived in landscapes. Next slide, please. Change is an inherent part of landscape. Cultural landscapes of our Indigenous peoples embody this because at their core is the intimate relationship of people with the land. The designation of places of importance such as Sadacho in the north, and more recently, Pemachuana Key as a World Heritage Site in Ontario and Manitoba would soon follow. Next, please. With the turn of the millennium, we now focused on and privileged multiple values, a respect for evolution, and the multitude of voices therein. This nation's seminal standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, our Bible, was the result.
You have 2 minutes.
Agreed upon among federal. The document was comprehensive in that it looked at all aspects of our heritage. The designation of the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa was the result of such work. Next slide, please. Of late, the second edition now steadfastly includes sustainable development considerations relevant in concert with the existential threat of climate change, global warming, and sea level rise. Ecological guidelines are now front and center rather than as afterthoughts. Standards and guidelines also emphasize traditional practices, timely given our own grappling with a checkered history in regards to our first peoples. To that end, with our strong sense of settler history and values, the present challenge is in conserving and enhancing historic places for future generations is notably looking at our seat of government, Parliament Hill, as an Indigenous cultural landscape. And needless to say, we have much work to do. The 92 calls for action emanating from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is but one small step in the right direction. Next slide, please. Recognizing cultural landscapes acknowledges that they are living places that evolve continuously through natural, cultural, and socio-economic processes, responding to an ever-changing world. We most certainly have come a long way from those early days of gardens as monuments, but we're not yet out of the proverbial woods. While it is clear that the discipline of heritage conservation related to cultural landscapes here in Canada has matured greatly over time, and that we have developed the right tools, including principles and best practices, we must now continue to right some wrongs and continue fighting the good fight. Thank you very much. Merci bien.